The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Captain James Crawford stood at attention. His red uniform was pristine, every button polished to perfection, his bearskin hat sitting tall on his head. For 15 years he had served the British royal family with unwavering dedication. He had protected 3 generations of royals, witnessed coronations, and stood guard through countless ceremonies. But today something felt different. Today his conscience would not let him remain silent. The palace was preparing for the Queen Consort's annual garden party. Staff rushed through the corridors, arranging flowers and setting up tables on the immaculate lawns. Queen Camilla was expected to make her grand entrance at noon, greeting dignitaries and guests from around the world. It was meant to be a celebration of her role, a demonstration of her acceptance by the British people. But Captain Crawford knew the truth that many were too afraid to speak. He had overheard conversations in the palace corridors. Whispers from senior staff members who remembered Princess Diana, the beloved people's princess whose memory still lived strong in the hearts of millions. They spoke quietly about how Queen Camilla's ascension to the title felt wrong to them, how it seemed to disrespect the legacy of the woman who had truly captured the nation's heart. These were loyal servants who would never speak publicly, but their private words reflected a sentiment that ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Captain Crawford had grown up admiring Princess Diana. His mother had kept newspaper clippings of her charity work, her visits to hospitals, her genuine compassion for those suffering. As a young boy, he had watched her funeral procession on television, seeing the entire nation mourning together. That image had never left him. When he joined the Royal Guard, he carried with him a deep respect for what true royalty meant, not just titles and crowns, but service, sacrifice, and genuine love for the people. Over the years, he had served Queen Camilla dutifully. He had opened doors for her, stood guard outside her chambers, and protected her at public events. She had always been polite to him, offering occasional nods of acknowledgement. But there was something missing. The common people did not gather with flowers when she passed. Children did not wave with genuine excitement. The warmth that had surrounded Princess Diana simply was not there. The situation had come to a head the previous week. Captain Crawford had been assigned to security detail during a private meeting between Queen Camilla and several members of Parliament. They were discussing plans to expand her official role, to give her more ceremonial duties and increase her public presence. One Parliament member had suggested that the public needed more time to accept her, that perhaps they should move slowly. Queen Camilla had responded with irritation, saying that she had waited long enough and that she deserved the same recognition that any other queen consort had received throughout history. That word, deserved, had struck Captain Crawford deeply. He thought about Princess Diana, who had never demanded recognition but had earned it through her actions. He thought about how Diana had held AIDS patients' hands when others feared to touch them, how she had walked through minefields to raise awareness, how she had broken royal protocol again and again to connect with ordinary people. Diana had not asked to be loved. She had simply loved others first, and that love had been returned to her 1,000-fold. Captain Crawford made his decision that night. He could no longer stand silently by, representing a system that seemed to have forgotten its own values. He was not a political person. He had no desire for fame or attention, but he believed in truth, and he believed that sometimes one person had to speak up, even when everyone else remained silent. He wrote a letter. It took him hours, drafting and redrafting, making sure his words were respectful but clear. He did not attack Queen Camilla personally. He simply stated what he believed to be true, that the title of Queen Consort carried with it a sacred responsibility to the British people, that it represented something beyond just being married to a king, and that in his conscience, he could not pretend that this responsibility was being fulfilled in the way the people deserved. The next morning, Captain Crawford requested an audience with the Queen Consort's private secretary. This was highly unusual. Guards did not request meetings. They stood silently and followed orders, but he insisted it was urgent. The secretary, a stern woman named Margaret who had worked in the palace for 30 years, reluctantly agreed to see him for 5 minutes. When Captain Crawford entered her office, Margaret looked up from her papers with barely concealed annoyance. She asked him to make it quick. He handed her the letter, sealed in an envelope addressed to Queen Camilla. Margaret frowned and asked what this was about. Captain Crawford explained that he was formally registering his concerns about his ability to continue serving as a royal guard, and that his reasons were outlined in the letter. He requested that the letter be delivered to Queen Camilla directly. Margaret's expression changed from annoyance to alarm. She asked if he was resigning. Captain Crawford replied that he was prepared to face whatever consequences came from speaking his truth, but that he hoped his concerns would at least be heard. Margaret told him to wait outside while she made some calls. An hour passed. Then 2. Captain Crawford stood in the corridor, his heart pounding. Other guards walked by, giving him curious glances. Word was beginning to spread that something unusual was happening. Finally, Margaret emerged and told him that he was being summoned to meet with the Queen Consort's Chief of Staff immediately. As Captain Crawford walked through the palace corridors toward that meeting, he knew his life was about to change forever. He did not know if he would be dismissed, disciplined, or perhaps even arrested for some obscure breach of protocol. But he felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, he was acting on his deepest convictions rather than simply following orders. The palace walls around him seemed to close in, centuries of tradition and hierarchy pressing down on his shoulders. But he walked with his head high, his uniform still immaculate, his conscience finally clear. Whatever happened next, he would face it, knowing that he had spoken for those who could not speak for themselves, for the memory of a princess who had shown him what true royalty meant, and for the millions of British people who still carried her in their hearts. The door to the Chief of Staff's office loomed ahead. Captain Crawford took a deep breath and knocked. The Chief of Staff's office was nothing like Captain Crawford had imagined. Instead of the grand, ornate room he expected, it was surprisingly modest. A simple desk sat beneath a portrait of King Charles, and the walls were lined with filing cabinets and bookshelves. Behind the desk sat Sir Edmund Price, a man in his late 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see through everything. Sir Edmund gestured for Captain Crawford to sit. The captain remained standing as protocol demanded. Sir Edmund smiled slightly and said that this was not a formal military proceeding, and that he should sit down. Reluctantly, Crawford took the chair across from the desk. Sir Edmund held up the sealed letter, turning it slowly in his hands. He had not opened it yet. The Chief of Staff spoke in a measured tone. He said that Margaret had informed him of this unusual situation, and that before he opened this letter, he wanted to understand exactly what Captain Crawford thought he was doing. Did the captain understand that the Royal Guard served at the pleasure of the Crown? Did he understand that personal opinions, no matter how strongly held, had no place in their duties? Captain Crawford met his gaze directly. He answered that he understood all of this perfectly well. He had spent 15 years following orders without question, but he was also a British citizen, and like every citizen, he had rights to his conscience and his beliefs. He was not refusing to perform his duties. He was simply asking that his concerns be heard by those in power, and then he would accept whatever decision they made about his future. Sir Edmund leaned back in his chair, studying the captain with new interest. He asked what could possibly be so important that Crawford would risk his entire career. The captain replied that it was about honor, about the meaning of service, and about staying true to the values that made the monarchy worth protecting in the first place. The Chief of Staff opened the letter. His eyes moved across the page, and Captain Crawford watched as his expression shifted from skepticism to surprise to something that might have been respect. When Sir Edmund finished reading, he set the letter down carefully and was silent for a long moment. Finally, Sir Edmund spoke. He said that this was perhaps the most extraordinary thing he had encountered in his 40 years of palace service. Captain Crawford had not written anything treasonous or disrespectful. He had simply articulated what many people felt, but would never dare say within these walls. The letter spoke of Princess Diana's legacy, of the special bond she had created with the British people, and of the responsibility that came with royal titles. It questioned whether that responsibility was being honored now. Sir Edmund told Crawford that he was putting him in an impossible position. The monarchy survived because people followed the rules, because personal feelings were set aside for the greater good of the institution. If every guard or servant started questioning royal titles based on their personal beliefs, chaos would follow. Yet, Sir Edmund admitted, There was something admirable about a man willing to risk everything for what he believed was right. The chief of staff said he would need to bring this to Queen Camilla herself. Such a significant matter could not be decided at his level. Captain Crawford would be suspended from active duty pending a decision. He was to return to his quarters and wait. Under no circumstances was he to speak to anyone about this situation. Did he understand? Captain Crawford understood. He stood saluted and left the office. As he walked back through the corridors, he felt strangely calm. The worst had not happened. He had not been immediately dismissed or arrested, but he knew the real test was still to come. In his small room in the guard barracks, Crawford sat on his bed and waited. Hours passed. He heard other guards coming and going, their voices muffled through the walls. Nobody knocked on his door. Nobody came to check on him. It was as if he had suddenly become invisible. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Queen Camilla was reading the letter for the third time. Sir Edmund stood respectfully near the window, waiting for her reaction. The Queen Consort's face showed little emotion as she read, but her hands gripped the paper tightly. When she finally looked up, her voice was controlled but cold. She asked Sir Edmund if he knew what this could turn into if word got out. A member of her own guard publicly questioning her worthiness for the throne. The press would have a field day. The old wounds about Diana would be reopened. All the work she had done to build acceptance would be damaged. Sir Edmund carefully pointed out that the letter was private. Captain Crawford had not gone to the media. He had followed proper channels, addressing his concerns internally. That showed a certain integrity. The Queen Consort responded sharply that it also showed disloyalty and disrespect. How dare a simple guard presume to judge whether she was worthy of her title? The Chief of Staff chose his next words carefully. He reminded Her Majesty that public sentiment was a delicate thing. The monarchy existed because the people allowed it to exist. If they dismissed Captain Crawford harshly, and if the story somehow leaked, it could confirm the very doubts that many people already harbored. But if they handled it wisely, perhaps there was an opportunity here. Queen Camilla asked what he meant by that. Sir Edmund explained that Captain Crawford was known among the guards as a man of impeccable character. If such a man had concerns, perhaps others did too. Perhaps this was a chance to understand what truly bothered people about her role, to address it rather than simply punish the messenger. The Queen Consort stood and walked to the window, looking out over the palace gardens where preparations for tomorrow's party continued. She was silent for a long time. Finally, she said that she wanted to meet with Captain Crawford personally. Sir Edmund was surprised. He warned that such a meeting was unprecedented and could be risky. What if the captain said something that made the situation worse? Queen Camilla turned to face him. She said that she had spent years being judged, criticized, and compared to a ghost. She had endured it because she loved Charles and believed in her duty. But she was tired of shadows and whispers. If this guard had the courage to write such a letter, then she would have the courage to face him directly. She wanted to understand what he saw when he looked at her, what he thought was missing. Sir Edmund reluctantly agreed to arrange the meeting. It would be tomorrow morning before the garden party, in the private sitting room. No one else would be present. Whatever was said in that room would stay between them. As night fell over Buckingham Palace, two people prepared for a conversation that neither of them truly wanted, but both somehow needed. Captain Crawford polished his uniform one more time, knowing he might never wear it again. Queen Camilla sat at her desk, staring at the letter that had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. The palace settled into its nighttime quiet, but sleep did not come easily to either of them. Captain Crawford woke before dawn, though he had barely slept. His mind had replayed the coming meeting 1,000 times, imagining every possible way it could go wrong. He dressed with extra care, his hands steady despite his racing heart. At precisely 8 o'clock, Sir Edmund appeared at his door and escorted him through the palace's private corridors. They walked in silence past portraits of kings and queens from centuries past. Crawford wondered what those long-dead monarchs would think of this moment, a common soldier about to challenge the current Queen Consort face to face. When they reached the private sitting room, Sir Edmund knocked softly and opened the door. Queen Camilla sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, even though no fire burned on this summer morning. She wore a simple blue dress, far less formal than her usual public attire. Her hands rested in her lap, and she looked smaller somehow, more human than the distant figure Crawford had guarded for years. Sir Edmund announced the captain's arrival and then quietly left, closing the door behind him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room was filled with uncomfortable silence, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Finally, Queen Camilla gestured to the chair across from her. She told him to sit. Crawford sat down, maintaining perfect posture. Queen Camilla studied his face as if seeing him for the first time. She asked him how long he had served in the Royal Guard. 15 years, he replied. She nodded slowly and said that was a long time to keep one's opinions hidden. What had changed? Why speak now? The captain took a breath and answered honestly. He said nothing had changed, which was exactly the problem. He had hoped that over time, he would see something that would ease his doubts. He had wanted to believe that the British people would embrace her the way they had embraced other royals. But the years had passed and that connection had never truly formed. He could not spend another decade standing silently, pretending everything was as it should be. Queen Camilla's expression hardened slightly. She asked if he had appointed himself the voice of the British people. Did he presume to know what millions of citizens thought and felt? Crawford replied that he did not presume anything. He only knew what he saw with his own eyes. When Princess Diana had walked among people, they reached out to her with genuine love. When Queen Camilla appeared in public, people were polite but distant. There was respect for her position but not for her personally. The Queen Consort stood abruptly and walked to the window. Her back was to Crawford and her voice was tight when she spoke. She said that she was aware of how people saw her. Did he think she was blind? Did he think she enjoyed being compared unfavorably to a dead woman every single day of her life? She had loved Charles before Diana ever entered the picture, but circumstances had torn them apart. When they finally found their way back to each other, the world decided she was the villain of the story. Crawford listened as Queen Camilla continued, her words coming faster now, years of held-back frustration pouring out. She spoke of the hatred she had endured, the protests, the cruel cartoons in newspapers. She talked about her children and grandchildren reading terrible things about her online. She mentioned the death threats, the security concerns, the way she could never simply be herself in public because every gesture was analyzed and judged. The captain waited until she finished. Then he spoke carefully, acknowledging that she had indeed suffered, and that much of the cruelty directed at her had been unfair. But he asked her to consider something. Princess Diana had also faced cruelty from the press and from certain members of the royal family. She had battled depression, eating disorders, and public humiliation. Yet instead of becoming bitter, she had channeled her pain into compassion for others. She had visited the sick, the dying, the forgotten. She had used her position to shine light on people and causes that others ignored. Queen Camilla turned from the window, her eyes sharp. She asked if he was suggesting she had done nothing charitable, nothing worthwhile. Crawford quickly said no, that was not his meaning. She had indeed supported many causes over the years, but there was a difference between supporting causes and truly connecting with people at their level. Diana had possessed a rare gift for making each person she met feel seen and valued. That gift had not come from her title. It had come from her heart. The Queen Consort sat back down, some of the fire leaving her eyes. She said quietly that she was not Diana and would never be Diana. She had different strengths, a different personality. Was it fair to expect her to be someone she was not? Crawford agreed that it was not fair to expect her to be Diana, but it was fair for the British people to expect their Queen Consort to genuinely care about them, to put their needs above her own comfort, to earn her title through service rather than simply accepting it through marriage. Queen Camilla was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost vulnerable. She asked what he wanted from her. Did he expect her to give up her title? To disappear? Captain Crawford shook his head. He said he had no expectations at all. He had simply reached a point where he could no longer remain silent. What she did with his concerns was entirely her decision. She asked what would happen if she dismissed him. Would he go to the press? Would he make this public? Crawford answered that he would not. His letter had been a private communication. If she chose to end his service, he would leave quietly and find another path in life. His goal had never been to damage the monarchy or cause scandal. He had only wanted someone in power to hear what many felt but dared not say. Queen Camilla stood and walked to the door. pausing with her hand on the handle. She told him that she would not dismiss him, at least not immediately. She needed time to think about everything he had said. He was to return to his quarters and wait for further instructions. The garden party would proceed as planned, and he was not to speak of this meeting to anyone. Crawford stood and bowed. As he reached the door, Queen Camilla spoke once more. She thanked him for his honesty, even though his words had hurt. It took courage to speak truth to power, she admitted. Not many people had that courage anymore, and perhaps that was one of the monarchy's greatest problems. Everyone was too afraid to tell them what they needed to hear. The captain left the room and walked back through the corridors. Sir Edmund was waiting at the end of the hallway, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. Crawford said nothing, only nodded respectfully and continued to his quarters. Behind the closed door of her sitting room, Queen Camilla stood alone, staring at the empty chair where a simple guard had just challenged everything she had built her life around. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to truly question whether the crown on her head was worth the price everyone seemed to be paying for it. The garden party proceeded exactly as planned. Under the brilliant afternoon sun, hundreds of guests mingled on the palace lawn, sipping tea and champagne, while a string quartet played classical music. Queen Camilla moved through the crowds with practiced grace, shaking hands and making polite conversation. To any observer, everything appeared perfectly normal, but Captain Crawford, standing at his assigned post near the east entrance, could see something different in her. The smile she wore seemed more strained than usual. Her movements were slightly mechanical, as if she was going through motions while her mind was elsewhere. Several times he noticed her gaze drift past the guests she was speaking with, a distant look crossing her face before she caught herself and returned her attention to the present. Among the guards stationed around the grounds, whispers had begun to spread. Something had happened with Captain Crawford, though nobody knew exactly what. He had been mysteriously absent from duty for a full day, and when he returned there was a tension around him that others could sense. Some guards speculated he had been disciplined. Others thought he might be ill. But Crawford remained silent, offering no explanations to his fellow guards' curious glances. As the afternoon wore on, a distinguished elderly woman approached Queen Camilla. Lady Margaret Thornberry had been a close friend of Princess Diana, and was one of the few people who could speak frankly to the royal family. She had been invited to the garden party as a courtesy, though everyone knew she still harbored complicated feelings about the current situation. Lady Margaret congratulated Queen Camilla on a lovely event, but her tone carried something beneath the politeness. The Queen Consort sensed it immediately and asked if something was troubling her. Lady Margaret hesitated, then said that she had heard interesting rumors from her contacts within the palace staff. Nothing specific, just a sense that something unusual was stirring behind the carefully maintained facade. Queen Camilla's composure flickered for just a moment. She suggested they take a walk away from the crowds. The two women moved toward a quieter section of the garden, their security detail following at a discreet distance. When they were relatively alone, Lady Margaret spoke more directly. She said that change was in the air, that people were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about the monarchy's future and relevance. The Queen Consort asked what kind of questions. Lady Margaret replied that young people especially were questioning whether the institution had any real meaning anymore. They looked at the vast wealth, the ceremonies, the titles, and asked what purpose it all served. Diana had given them an answer, Lady Margaret said softly. She had shown them that royalty could be a force for genuine good. That privilege came with responsibility to serve those less fortunate. Queen Camilla felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. First Captain Crawford's challenge, and now this reminder from someone who had known Diana personally. She asked Lady Margaret if she thought her time as Queen Consort had been worthless, if she had contributed nothing of value. The older woman took her time answering, choosing her words carefully. Lady Margaret said that Queen Camilla had done many good things, supported important causes, and brought stability to Charles's life. But there was a difference between doing good things and inspiring people. Diana had inspired millions to be better, kinder, more compassionate. She had made the monarchy feel relevant and necessary. Without that inspiration, the institution was just an expensive museum piece, beautiful but ultimately pointless. The words stung because they echoed what Captain Crawford had said that morning. Queen Camilla asked Lady Margaret what she should do differently. The elderly woman smiled sadly and said that was not a question she could answer. Only Camilla herself could decide what kind of legacy she wanted to leave. But whatever she decided, it needed to be authentic. People could sense when someone was performing duty versus when someone was genuinely invested in making a difference. As they walked back toward the party, Queen Camilla's mind raced. Two very different people, a palace guard and a society lady, had essentially told her the same thing within hours of each other. She could dismiss one voice as an outlier, but two voices began to sound like a chorus. How many others felt this way but remained silent? The party concluded as the sun began to set, casting golden light across the palace grounds. Guests departed, thanking their hosts and complimenting the lovely afternoon. As the last visitors left, Queen Camilla retreated to her private chambers, exhausted not from the physical demands of hosting, but from the emotional weight of the day. Sir Edmund knocked on her door an hour later. He had come to discuss the Captain Crawford situation and to get her final decision on how to proceed. The Chief of Staff expected her to order Crawford's dismissal. It would be the clean, simple solution that avoided any further complications. Instead, Queen Camilla surprised him. She said she wanted to review all the public engagement requests that had come to her office over the past year. She wanted to see which ones had been accepted and which had been declined. She wanted the honest assessment from her staff about her public perception, no sugarcoating or diplomatic language. And she wanted recommendations for ways she could more meaningfully engage with ordinary British citizens. Sir Edmund was taken aback. He asked if this was because of what the guard had said. Queen Camilla replied that it was because of what the guard, Lady Margaret, and probably thousands of others had thought but never said directly to her face. She had spent years defending her right to her position, insisting that she deserved respect and recognition, but perhaps, she admitted, she had focused too much on what she deserved and not enough on what the people needed from her. The Chief of Staff asked about Captain Crawford's future. Should he be returned to full duty? Queen Camilla thought for a moment, then made an unexpected decision. She wanted Crawford assigned to her personal security detail. Sir Edmund protested that this made no sense. Why reward someone who had essentially questioned her authority? Queen Camilla explained that Crawford had done something none of her advisors had ever done. He had told her a difficult truth at great personal risk. She needed people around her who would be honest, not just loyal. Sir Edmund left the meeting shaking his head in bewilderment. In his 4 decades of palace service, he had never seen anything quite like this. A crisis that should have ended in dismissal and discipline was somehow turning into an opportunity for change. He was not sure if this was wisdom or folly, but he had to admit there was something remarkable about a woman willing to learn from her critics, rather than simply silencing them. That evening, Captain Crawford received word that he was to report for duty the following morning. His assignment had been changed. He would now serve on the Queen Consort's immediate protection team. The message came with no explanation, no context. Crawford read it 3 times, trying to understand what it meant. Was this a punishment, keeping him close where he could be watched? Or was it something else entirely? As he lay in bed that night, Captain Crawford realized that his simple act of conscience had set something in motion that neither he nor Queen Camilla could fully control. The palace, that ancient institution built on tradition and carefully maintained appearances, had been shaken by truth. What would grow from those cracks remained to be seen. 3 weeks had passed since that extraordinary garden party, and Captain Crawford was still adjusting to his new role. Being part of Queen Camilla's personal security detail meant he was constantly near her, standing just outside meeting rooms, accompanying her to engagements, seeing the private moments between public appearances. It was strange and uncomfortable at first, like being trapped in a room with someone you had criticized to their face. Queen Camilla had not spoken directly to him since their confrontation. She acknowledged his presence with brief nods, but nothing more. Crawford wondered if she was waiting for him to quit, if this assignment was meant to make him so uncomfortable that he would resign on his own. But he was determined to fulfill his duty, regardless of the awkwardness. The real change became apparent during Queen Camilla's public engagements. Her staff had noticed it first. She was accepting invitations she would have previously declined, visiting places that were not traditionally on the royal circuit. Instead of another museum opening or charity gala, she requested visits to community centers, homeless shelters, and public hospitals. Her first unscheduled stop was at a food bank in South London. The organizers had only been given a few hours' notice, barely enough time to prepare. When Queen Camilla arrived, there was no red carpet, no formal reception line, just volunteers sorting donated goods and families waiting to receive assistance. Captain Crawford watched from his position near the door as something unexpected happened. At first, Queen Camilla moved through the space with her usual formality, shaking hands and making polite inquiries. But then she encountered a young mother with 2 small children. The woman was trying to juggle a crying baby while helping her toddler pick out groceries. The diaper bag had split, spilling its contents across the floor. The mother looked exhausted and overwhelmed, barely registering who was standing beside her. Queen Camilla did something that surprised everyone present. She bent down and began picking up the scattered items, talking softly to the toddler to distract him while the mother tended to the baby. There were no cameras present, no press to capture the moment. It was simply a spontaneous act of help for someone who needed it. The young mother finally looked up and realized who was helping her. She froze, mortified, but Queen Camilla smiled and assured her it was perfectly fine. They talked for nearly 10 minutes. Not the brief, scripted exchanges typical of royal visits, but a real conversation. The mother shared her struggles, working 2 jobs but still unable to afford rent and groceries. Queen Camilla listened without interruption, without offering platitudes or quick solutions. When it was time to leave, she asked the food bank director about the systemic issues causing such hardship, taking notes and promising to follow up. Captain Crawford saw something shift in Queen Camilla that day. On the drive back to the palace, she was quiet but not withdrawn. She was thinking deeply about what she had seen and heard. Over the following weeks, this pattern continued. More visits to places where real people struggled with real problems. More conversations without cameras or staged photo opportunities. The palace staff was initially resistant to these changes. Sir Edmund expressed concern about security in unpredictable environments. The press secretary worried about the lack of controlled messaging. But Queen Camilla insisted. She said she had spent too long worrying about how things looked and not enough time actually doing things that mattered. One rainy afternoon, she visited a hospice center for terminal patients. Captain Crawford accompanied her through the quiet hallways where people were spending their final days. She sat with an elderly man who had no family, listening as he talked about his life, his regrets, his fears. She held the hand of a woman dying of cancer, offering no false hope but genuine presence. Crawford watched and remembered how Princess Diana had done the same thing decades ago, breaking barriers by simply showing up and caring. After that visit, as they drove back through London's wet streets, Queen Camilla finally spoke to Captain Crawford directly for the first time since their confrontation. She asked him if he had seen the news coverage of her recent visits. Crawford replied that he had. The press was reporting on her activities, but the tone was still somewhat skeptical, questioning whether this was genuine change or just a calculated image makeover. Queen Camilla nodded, unsurprised. She said that she understood their skepticism. She had spent years being one version of herself, and people were right to question a sudden transformation. But she told Crawford something that stayed with him. She said she had realized that she had been so focused on defending her position, on proving she deserved to be queen consort, that she had forgotten the most important part. The title was not a prize to be won or a status to be claimed. It was a responsibility to serve. Crawford felt something shift in his own perception. This was not the defensive, bitter woman he had confronted weeks ago. Something had changed. She asked him if he thought she was wasting her time, if people would ever see past their predetermined judgments of her. Crawford chose his words carefully. He said that people could forgive almost anything if they sensed genuine remorse and effort to change. Princess Diana had not been perfect either. She had made mistakes, struggled with her own demons. But people loved her because she was authentic in her compassion. Queen Camilla smiled slightly, a real smile rather than the practiced one she used in public. She said that she would never be Diana, and she had finally accepted that. But perhaps she could be the best version of herself, and maybe that would be enough. She thanked Crawford for his honesty, even though it had been painful to hear. Sometimes, she admitted, We need someone to hold up a mirror and show us what we have become. The car pulled into the palace gates. As Captain Crawford opened her door, Queen Camilla paused before exiting. She told him that she was planning a significant public address in 2 weeks. She wanted to acknowledge the distance between herself and the British people, to speak honestly about her failures and her commitment to change. It would be risky, opening herself up to criticism and mockery, but she felt it was necessary. She asked if he thought it was a mistake. Crawford replied that the biggest mistake would be to remain silent, to pretend everything was fine when clearly it was not. The British people respected honesty, even when it revealed imperfection. Queen Camilla nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping out of the car and walking toward the palace entrance. Over the next 2 weeks, the palace became a hive of activity. Speechwriters drafted and redrafted her address. Advisors debated every word, every phrase. Some urged her to be cautious, to avoid admitting too much. Others, including Sir Edmund, who had surprisingly become an ally in this transformation, encouraged her to be bold and transparent. Captain Crawford watched it all from his position on her security detail. He saw the late nights she spent revising the speech herself, refusing to let others soften her message. He saw the anxiety in her face as the date of the address approached. He saw the resolve that grew stronger with each passing day. The night before the address, Queen Camilla walked through the palace gardens alone, or as alone as someone with constant security could be. Captain Crawford followed at a respectful distance. She stopped near a memorial rose garden planted in Princess Diana's honor. For a long time she stood there in silence, perhaps making peace with a ghost that had haunted her for decades. When she finally turned back toward the palace, there were tears on her face, but her shoulders were straight and her step was steady. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would face it honestly. The address was scheduled for 7 o'clock in the evening, a time when most British families would be home from work, able to watch if they chose. The speech would be broadcast live from the palace's stateroom, a formal setting that Queen Camilla had deliberately selected. She wanted this to be official, significant, not just another casual interview or public appearance. Captain Crawford stood in the corridor outside the stateroom as the production crew made final preparations. Through the doorway, he could see Queen Camilla sitting in her chair, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. She looked smaller than usual, vulnerable in a way he had never seen during public events. A makeup artist offered to touch up her appearance, but she declined. She wanted to appear exactly as she was, without artifice. King Charles had offered to stand beside her during the address, but she had refused. This was something she needed to do alone on her own authority, taking responsibility for her own choices and mistakes. The king had reluctantly agreed, though he would be watching from his private study, as would millions of others across the Commonwealth. The broadcast began precisely on time. The cameras focused on Queen Camilla, and she looked directly into the lens with an expression that was neither defiant nor apologetic, simply honest. She began by acknowledging that this was an unusual address, that normally the royal family communicated through carefully crafted statements and formal occasions, but these were not normal circumstances, and careful statements would no longer suffice. She spoke about her journey to becoming queen consort, not hiding from the controversy that had surrounded her relationship with Charles. She acknowledged the pain that their relationship had caused Diana and many others. She did not make excuses or try to justify past actions. She simply stated the facts as they were, admitting that she had been complicit in causing hurt to someone who had not deserved it. Then she spoke about Princess Diana herself. This was the moment that made Captain Crawford hold his breath, along with millions watching around the world. Queen Camilla said that Diana had possessed a gift for connecting with people that was rare and precious. She had shown the world what modern royalty could be, breaking down barriers and touching lives in meaningful ways. Her loss had been devastating not just to her family but to the entire nation. Queen Camilla paused, clearly gathering her courage for what came next. She said that for years she had tried to be different from Diana, to establish her own identity and avoid comparisons, but in doing so, she had missed the most important lesson Diana had taught. Being royal was not about titles, ceremonies, or maintaining dignified distance from ordinary people. It was about service, genuine service that required getting one's hands dirty and one's heart involved. She admitted that she had failed in this responsibility. She had focused too much on her own position, Her own acceptance, her own comfort. She had performed her duties technically, but without the heart and soul that Diana had brought to everything she did. She had been a queen consort in name, but had not truly served the people as she should have. The room was silent except for her voice. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath. Queen Camilla continued, describing her recent visits to communities across Britain. She talked about the young mother at the food bank, the dying patients at the hospice, the volunteers working tirelessly to help their neighbors. These experiences had opened her eyes to how disconnected she had been, how much she had not understood about the struggles ordinary people faced. She announced several concrete commitments. She would be dramatically increasing her personal involvement in charitable work, not just lending her name but actively participating. She would be visiting communities without advance notice, engaging with people in their real environments rather than carefully staged events. She would be using her position to advocate for policy changes that would actually help people, even when that made her uncomfortable or brought controversy. More significantly, she acknowledged that actions would speak louder than her words tonight. She understood that many people would remain skeptical, that trust once broken was not easily rebuilt. She asked only for the opportunity to prove through sustained effort that this change was genuine. If after time people still felt she was unworthy of her title, she would accept their judgment. This last statement sent shockwaves through the viewing audience. No member of the royal family had ever offered to essentially submit their position to public approval. It was unprecedented, perhaps even reckless, but it was also deeply human and remarkably brave. Queen Camilla concluded by thanking one person specifically, though she did not name him. She said that sometimes the most valuable gift we can receive is painful honesty, from someone who cares enough to speak truth, when everyone else remains silent. That unnamed person's courage had forced her to examine herself in ways she had avoided for too long. She hoped others in positions of power would be fortunate enough to have people around them who valued truth over comfort. Captain Crawford felt his throat tighten. He knew she was speaking about him, though no one else would make the connection. When the broadcast ended, there was a moment of stunned silence before the stateroom erupted in activity. Advisors rushed in, press secretaries were already fielding calls, and Sir Edmund appeared at Crawford's side, shaking his head in amazement. The chief of staff said quietly that in 40 years of service, he had never seen anything like what had just happened. A senior royal had essentially apologized to the nation, admitted failure, and offered to step down if the people wished it. It was either political suicide or the most brilliant move in modern royal history. Only time would tell which. The initial media reaction was mixed. Some commentators praised Queen Camilla's honesty and courage. Others cynically dismissed it as a calculated image campaign. Social media exploded with opinions from every possible perspective. But something interesting began to happen over the following days and weeks. People started sharing videos of Queen Camilla's recent visits to communities, the unscripted moments of genuine connection. The young mother from the food bank was interviewed and spoke movingly about how the queen consort had treated her with real kindness and dignity. Hospice workers talked about the sincere compassion they had witnessed. Slowly, cautiously, public sentiment began to shift. It was not a dramatic transformation. Many people remained unconvinced. The wounds from the past ran too deep for some to ever forgive or forget. But there was a growing recognition that something had genuinely changed, that this was not just clever public relations but a real effort to do better. Captain Crawford continued his duties on Queen Camilla's security detail. Their relationship remained largely professional, but there was a mutual respect that had not existed before. She occasionally sought his opinion on engagement plans, valuing his perspective as someone who would tell her the truth rather than what she wanted to hear. 6 months after the address, Queen Camilla visited a community center in the same neighborhood where Captain Crawford had grown up. She had not known this detail when scheduling the visit, but Crawford arranged for his mother to attend. When Queen Camilla met her, the older woman curtsied respectfully, then surprised everyone by thanking the queen consort for her honesty and her efforts to change. Crawford's mother said that she had loved Princess Diana and always would, but she could also respect someone who admitted their mistakes and worked to become better. Diana herself had been someone who grew and changed throughout her life, who had struggled and learned. Perhaps the greatest tribute to Diana's memory was not to demand that everyone else be just like her, but to follow her example of courage and compassion in whatever form it took. Queen Camilla was visibly moved by these words. After the event, as she and Captain Crawford walked back to the car, she thanked him again for his honesty all those months ago. She said she still had far to go, that earning true acceptance would be the work of years, not months. But for the first time since becoming Queen Consort, she felt like she was doing something meaningful with her position. Crawford replied that serving with honor was its own reward, regardless of recognition or titles. Queen Camilla smiled and said that perhaps they had both learned that lesson together. As the car pulled away from the community center, she looked back at the people waving from the doorway. They were not cheering wildly like crowds had once cheered for Diana, but they were waving with genuine warmth, and that was a start. In the end, Captain Crawford's moment of courage had not destroyed the monarchy or brought down a queen. Instead, it had sparked something more profound: the possibility of redemption through honest self-examination and genuine change. The palace was still the palace, with all its traditions and protocols. But within those ancient walls, one woman had chosen to listen to a difficult truth and allow it to transform her. History would judge whether Queen Camilla succeeded in her mission to truly serve the British people. But regardless of the final verdict, she had done something remarkable. She had chosen growth over defensiveness, humility over pride, and service over status. And in doing so, she had shown that even institutions as old and rigid as the monarchy could still evolve when someone had the courage to challenge them from within and the wisdom